to The God Conclusion. I'm your host, John Leonard. Welcome, listeners. This is my good friend, Jim Nettles. And Jim and I have been friends 45 years. Yes. Now, you look like you're only 45, but I hate to break it to you, Jim. You are a little bit older than that.
That's funny.
It is. But one of the reasons why I wanted to speak to listeners, and I do need to mention that we had a conversation and had a great conversation that lasted 2.5 hours. And there was a technical malfunction and none of it got recorded. And so we're starting all over. But when we talk, there's been a lot of ground that we've already covered that we aren't going to necessarily be covering again. We'll just refer to it. But we won't leave out any salient details of the story. But the story, I'm going to tell the listeners a story, and it goes back 45 years. I was in college at Armstrong State College, and our mutual friend, Mark Chandaff, introduced me to Jim, and I got to be good friends with Jim almost immediately. We just had a lot of interest in common. And one night, I was over at Jim's house. I used to work downtown, and I'd get off about 10 o'clock on a Friday night, and that would be perfect timing to swing by Jim's house and then go over to the nearby bar. And so I had just gotten off work.
Stonehenge or something in the day, wasn't it?
It was called Stonehenge back then. And Jim stepped over to the light switch and turned off the lights. And in his house, he lived in an older house, and the light switches were the 2-button variety, where you pushed in one button and the other button would push out and they would audibly click into place. It's very unmistakable how these light switches operated. Jim stepped over, turned off the lights, stepped back over to the kitchen island next to me. We're about to walk out the door, and the lights come back on. And those switches were readily visible from my vantage point. I could see both switches. I saw a switch toggle that should not have been able to toggle. And I looked at Jim and I said, "That was a very neat trick. How did you do that?" And Jim laughed and said, "My house is haunted." And that began an adventure that lasted several years for me. I had dozens, if not hundreds, of experiences in Jim's house. And the reason I'm talking about all of this is I wrote a book called The God Conclusion, which hopefully listeners are familiar with by now. And in the book, I'm making an argument for a supernatural God that's independent of religious dogma. It's not preaching from the Bible. It's using scientific evidence and logic to argue that God exists. And one of the reasons I believe this so strongly is because I believe the supernatural exists. Now, Richard Dawkins, who wrote The God Delusion, and in his book, he said there is no such thing as any supernatural entities. And in Jim's house, I experienced an intelligence that was not visible to the naked eye. Now, Jim, I'd like you to talk about your experiences because you grew up in this house.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks for sharing in that setup. Yeah, I did. I grew up in the house, and by the time you came over to see the house, I was 16 years old. So I think I was 16 years old. I think I just turned 16 years old, actually. Isn't that the way the math works on that one? And so I think that was the case. And 17 years old, maybe. But anyhow, the fact is that was normal in my house. So there was nothing unusual about that from my perspective. And it had been that way ever since I was a kid. The lights would come on, the lights would go off, the doors would open, the doors would close, you'd hear things happen, things would move around, things would appear, things would disappear. Piano would play by itself. So that was not we had an elevator in the house, and the elevator would go up and down, and you sometimes would hear voices, and every morning there were sounds in the kitchen, like someone was up making breakfast in the kitchen, and you'd hear pots and pans and rattling around, and you would go downstairs and nobody would be there. That would really freak people out who were guests who would come over and stay at our house, because we who lived there were just used to that. And then people would go downstairs and be sitting downstairs tremoring or something. We go, oh, don't worry about that. That's just the old lady. Gets up in the morning, makes breakfast. So it's no big deal. So that was the attitude that I grew up with in the house.
That's interesting. You describe her as an old lady as if you identified a personality with this entity.
With that particular entity, that's what I'm saying, is that we had the old lady that did the stuff in the kitchen. We had the guy who sat in the chair in the library. We had different people who did different things. For us, it was like there was a whole house of things happening. And they had different, actually, yeah. So when I was little, I don't actually vividly remember this, but apparently I talked when I was really young. So I would come see my mom and go, Mom, you need to turn the light on in the library. The man's sitting in the rocking chair. He needs to have light on. And she'd go, okay. Then she'd go and she'd turn the light on the rocking chair and that sort of thing. Because we had a rocking chair where we had this guy who would sit and he would smoke a pipe and read. And we had another place where other things happened. And the lady.
You smelled the pipe smoke.
Yeah. I mean, people would come in and they would be like, who's been smoking in the house?
Very interesting. It was a wide variety. And I would say that your parents, they were not necessarily scientists, but they tended to apply the scientific approach, a scientific method to the investigation process. The first thing they did was when there were electrical issues with the light switches in the elevator, you got an elevator repairman, you got an electrician out there to investigate.
Right. But as I said, that was actually before I was born. So I wasn't privy to that whole part of the story. That had already predated me, because the issues with the house, they bought the house before I was born. Maybe my mom was pregnant with me, or I don't know, whatever. But they had contracted to have renovations done before we actually moved into the house. So they had heard reports of all kinds of things happening in the house. And of course, they had an electrical system redone. They had electricians in there. They had an elevator installed. They had all these things done in terms of fixing up this house, because they had bought it out of the Oliver estate, which was the family who had owned that house and the house next door to it. And they were the families who had bought those lots and built those homes in 1908, I guess, is maybe when they started, maybe when they bought the lots and so forth. Because you remember they had the Global Grand Prix in Savannah. I think it was in 1900, and Estelle Avenue, which was the dirt track that became the thing for that. And then they built these homes after that, because the location there on what is now Victory Drive was actually, Victory Drive used to be the racetrack, Estelle Avenue.
Amazing. I didn't know that.
You know that part of history? Yeah, if you actually go back, it was cool. I had heard that before, but I recently went back into the Savannah history thing. So it was a major deal. And that was the thing that brought so much economic growth and so forth to Savannah, was that they had this international Grand Prix. So they had sports cars from all over the world who were coming into the Savannah port, and they were racing around the track that was Victory Drive was the far edge of outside of downtown. So the whole south side thing was just rural and urban and all that sort of thing. So they made it was a loop that went from across what was Victory Drive over to the edge where the Wilmington River was, and up that way through what we think of as Thunderbolt, and looped around back and forth in order to have the track. And apparently they had big bleachers and so forth set along that area where that house is currently. So the house was built, yeah.
So you've given me a picture. You've shared several family photos with me, And one of the pictures was dated 1922, and it's of that house that we're talking about.
Correct. And that was, like I said, I think that house was finished in 1914, maybe. And I think that the house next door to it was finished in 1916 or 18, something like that. So it was a relatively new house when that photo was taken. That's the interesting thing about that photo I sent you, was that my parents bought the house in 1962. Well, 1961. I was born in 62. And I think I sent you a photograph also that was actually the listing photo that I found in my mom's records, which interestingly is almost identical to that photo from the 1922, which I showed.
With more foliage around it.
Yeah, so that was an interesting thing, because my Aunt Irma, who was my mother's great aunt, had died. She was in her 80s, and she lived behind us in the garage apartment there at the house. And so they had the memorial service, and people came from all over, and the relatives. And of course, my mom's, anyhow, we had this event at the house. I think it was Irma. It may have actually been her mom's mom. I don't know. But the thing is, it must have been Irma's. Because I can remember it was some cousin or aunt or something of my mother. And I'm little Jimmy, and I'm being introduced to all the different relatives. And the lady goes, "Oh, Melba, I remember." She goes, "This is amazing. I took a photo back when we were here in this house." And my mom goes, "Oh, really? Could you send me that?" And so that's what I sent you. What I showed you. It's the photograph that the aunt mailed to my mom that she had taken with the handwritten thing that she had notarized it on the back, which was the house on Estelle Avenue.
That's awesome.
Incidentally, and it was the identical photograph to the one that was the one when they bought the house. It's just wild, right?
The house hasn't changed much. It's just the
angle of the shot is.
Yes.
Now, true, it was a good angle to shoot the house, but I think the lady was just driving by in her car when she took the picture.
That's interesting.
That's bizarre, right?
It is. So now we've already indirectly answered one of the questions that I was going to be confirming for listeners, and that was that you are not some world-class illusionist who has been deceiving me for the last 45 years to convince me to believe something that isn't really true. And because of the fact that these things were happening in the house before you were born, that would make you an illusionist beyond compare if you could do things pre-birth. But one of the things that over the years, like I said, the things that happened in the house, it almost became routine. It became mundane, that they would do what I would consider to be harmless, like a teenage prank, hiding keys and putting them back, riding the elevators, that sort of thing. But you and I were playing chess one night in the attic, and there was a rocking chair that was positioned on the side of the board where somebody could sit and watch while we played, as that would be interesting, watching a chess game. But the chair started moving like someone was rocking in it. And I immediately noted that there weren't any air vents in the attic that could be moving this. And I didn't see any strings or anything like that. But then the chair began to quiver. The arms began to quiver like somebody had put their weight on the arms of the chair and used them to press up and get out of the chair. And then I felt movement coming toward and then moving past me. And I felt an invisible finger start on my right shoulder blade and go across to my left shoulder blade. And I don't remember much more details of that night, except for I think I conceded that game pretty quickly.
That's funny.
I felt like whatever was getting irritated, that I was no longer responding, and it felt like it had to get my attention.
That's funny.
And you were the home team, so they were on your side.
That may be true. I played a lot of chess in that house.
Yeah, you were a very intelligent child. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about was your experiences in India and meeting the Dalai Lama and your time spent in the Theosophical Society.
Ooh, let's see. That is, yeah. I mean, so the thing is with the Theosophical Society is that Theosophia means God, wisdom. And the bottom line is that when my parents moved in the house, they didn't believe in ghosts. They didn't have some belief system about that sort of thing. That wasn't their personalities. As I said,
I didn't believe in ghosts until I came to your house and had those experiences. I thought ghosts were Casper cartoon characters on television.
and you are not alone. I shared this with one of my sisters that you and I had this conversation just yesterday. She laughed and said, "Yeah, lots of my friends tell all these stories when they came to our house." Also, it was just normal because there was definitely something that was going on there, and we couldn't explain it. My parents were very pragmatic about a lot of things. They were both of them were very intelligent. They had married. My dad's first wife had died, and then my mom had never married, and she ended up marrying my dad shortly after his wife died, and that's then he had 4 daughters from his previous marriage. And I don't know, the whole thing was just unusual in terms of their getting together, quite frankly. But then they were looking for a bigger house from where he had lived previously, because I guess they got pregnant with me, and also they just decided to move. And in the house, they had all this phenomenon that was happening, and there was no explanation for how it was happening. And they'd already gone through like talking to my dad was Baptist, my mom was Methodist. They were active in their churches, had been for a long time. My dad had founded his church. My mom was and her aunts were very active. And you go back to their whole lineage of the Eves. That's the last name. EVE is their historical name. And they were big buddies with John Wesley. And the whole thing my dad was John the Baptist, kind of Baptist, Duncan the River Baptist from the olden days. But they had a pretty solid belief in whoever it was, I guess in a belief in good rather than evil. It was like whatever their version of spirituality was. So when they first got to the house, stuff happened. The lights would come on and off and so forth. So they called the electrician. The elevator would go up and down by itself. So they would call the electrician. The doors would open and close. So they had carpenters come over to take a look at things. My dad would check the level to make sure that what happened, how did this door swing like that? Because it doesn't make physical sense that it works that way. So they'd gone through all of that, and they talked to the people in their respective churches who actually, quite frankly, in those days just got scared having that kind of a conversation. So it was not something that they could have a practical conversation about something, because spiritual entities were thought of as being evil.
And that was one thing that never got the impression about any paranormal spirit that was in your house that there was any sort of malevolence associated with them. It was
right. That's exactly what I was saying, is that the whole vibe that we got being there was that maybe we just had the attitude that maybe it was the family who had lived in the house before, and they had died, and they'd loved that house and built it for them, and they were still there. They were getting up in the morning, making breakfast and smoking the pipe and the other thing, and they just hadn't moved on to whatever the next stage of the game was. But so after having gotten referrals to this other thing, and I can remember my dad had the people from the Catholic Church come. I think I gave you a story about that.
Yeah, that was pretty funny.
It was pretty funny, but he didn't have anything to do with that, because
you don't need an exorcism if you're not dealing with a demon, I don't think.
No, that was the thing, when they came over to the house, they came over with this idea of the priest was suited up and the nuns were wearing their habits and so forth, and they had crosses and little things it weren't like burning incense, but they had whatever the little stuff they carried around that made them look official. I guess they had holy water and something. They had a little case with stuff. And so they went through the house, and when we got up to the attic, you referred to the attic. So we got up to the attic, and one of the nuns goes, "Oh, yeah," she did this like reaction thing, and then she started like speaking in Latin, and then this, and then they started doing this thing about something about driving out evil spirits. And my dad goes, "Oh, no, none of that satanic mumbo jumbo in my house." And he grabs the priest by the back of his collar there. I got a little hat on and so forth. He grabs him like this. He goes, "You're getting out of my house right now." And he just pushes him towards the door of the third floor of the Victory Drive house. And so this dude, and my dad, he held him by the collar all the way down the flight of stairs, all the way down again, all the way to the front door. Two little nuns are going. I mean, I'm right behind my dad and him. The nuns are right behind me, all the way down. He puts him out in the carport and he says, "You're leaving my house and you're never coming back." So that was that. So that was like the colorful entrance to the Theosophical Society. So that was the fact was they decided that they needed to look at other belief systems. And so Theosophia means God wisdom. And so it's a study of comparative religions and spirituality and alternative ways of looking at the world. So that was that. So my parents became active in the Theosophical Society. They had meetings at our house every Wednesday. They continued to go to their respective Baptist and Methodist churches. And they just included this other thing as part of our life. Yeah. So,
Interesting.
Yeah. So that was that. So,
now, one of the things that to me gave validation to my beliefs that the paranormal was involved in your house, I found a book in the local library down there called Savannah Specters. And there was an entire chapter devoted to your house there on East Broad Street, and mentioned you as a young child. And one of the things that they talked about was that Ed and Lorraine Warren, who gained fame from the Conjuring movies, some of their stories, I think they were involved with the Amityville Horror too, but world famous for doing paranormal investigations. And so to have them come to your house and do an investigation gives great credibility to the story that there was no natural explanation for what was going on.
Right. There wasn't. And I didn't remember the Warrens per se, but I do remember, I think that maybe when they came, I think we had some researchers from Duke come at the same time, but I remember the same deal of being a kid and going around with whoever it was at that time. And the same thing, they went up in the attic, and when they got to this area in the attic, whatever their gizmo was, because they had a little electronic device where they were like Ghostbusters thing, go in and they would measure electromagnetic variations of some things that would happen. And so they got up there and their meter goes, so then they were like doing that thing. But basically it was in the same place that when the nuns freaked out.
And I had my most memorable experience.
Yeah. But the interesting thing, I was having a discussion yesterday with one of my brother-in-laws, and he'd been talking about it with a different one of my brother-in-laws who they lived in the house after we moved out, and he was asking him about his experiences in the house and what he had experienced. And his response was, people's experience of being with a spirit is really a function of whatever it is they're bringing to that experience from their past.
I'm not sure I agree with that, because there was no experience from my past that had any impact on what happened in your house that first night with the light switches. It was just something that it was bored, or it was curious. It was wanting to entertain me, but it got my attention. But in my book, I am careful not to call our mutual shared experiences evidence. I say they're anecdotes. They're stories that I tell that explain why I believe what I believe. And then having read Jung said that you can tell me that you haven't had the same experience that I have. But what you cannot do is you cannot tell me that my experience was not real.
Yes.
So you can tell me, somebody else can tell me, I've never had any experiences with ghosts remotely like yours. And I can say, yeah, but you aren't me. And I did have these experiences. And most importantly, I have a witness to them, which is you. And that makes me ask this question. Am I wrong in characterizing this evidence as anecdotal when arguably it's empirical evidence collected via the scientific method, which is observation is a key component?
And I think that this kind of discussion back and forth is part of the scientific method. And I'm not saying that anybody's crazy. I'm saying that if you're going to do a scientific experiment, you'll get multiple witnesses if you're like just using a witness event, you'll get multiple witnesses. And generally you're going to get multiple stories of whatever the phenomenon is. People will see the same thing happen and they will tell you different versions of the story. That's all
absolutely
comes in with it. And then also over time, we're remembering things in the past and we get layers. Like for me, like version of your story, for example, is that I don't ever remember actually playing the chess in the attic. We would have it downstairs. We're coming back to this because it was actually something I wanted to mention last time when you shared that story with me, is that I sort of remember that. Like I said, it happened all the time in my house, so it wasn't that like big in my memory banks. But my recollection is we were downstairs playing chess in the living room, and I got up because I had left you cornered and you were having to think about it in terms of getting to the next move. And so I get up and I leave the room to go around the corner, go to the bathroom or whatever. And when I came back, that's when you were completely freaked out. And you had this deal about what you'd seen and so forth and so on. And so then it was like, yeah, that's not terribly uncommon for that to happen. Because
these memories are 40. These memories are 40 years, more than 40 years old.
Yeah, and I think that after that, we had other experiences where we went up and I showed you the attic, and we hung out a lot after that. But what I'm saying is that you really had an experience, and then I really remember you having the experience. The details of it are things that people put together in a different way. That's what my brother-in-law was essentially saying, is that it gets colored by other things over time. So you can't say, oh, absolutely yes or no in a particular way. But
it's basically, this is eyewitness testimony. And when you have eyewitnesses, if you have 3 or 4 eyewitnesses that come into court and they all tell the exact same story, yeah, every detail is the same, the judge is going to say those witnesses were coached. The testimony is invalid, because you're exactly right. People have different experiences. They have different perspectives of the same experience. And we had a number of experiences over an extended period of time. And like, I remember car keys and going to the beach, and you remember the car keys and going to the beach. And our memories of that same episode are different because more than 40 years have elapsed.
Exactly.
But it made an indelible impression in our memories that there was an experience where keys behaved in an irrational manner. And I distinctly remember you looking up at the ceiling and saying, we'd like to go to the beach. And so if you put the keys back where you got them from, we'd really appreciate it. And it was something to that effect. Yeah. And the keys were back exactly where they had been missing from when we looked again.
Yeah, you had articulated that last time too. I think that what had happened was I'd come in, I'd sat the keys down on the kitchen table. It was covered in newspapers and all sorts of things there because that was the way my parents kept their news. You know, they just had it stacked up with like weeks or months or whatever the thing was. And so I'd sat the keys down, and we came back to look for keys and no keys. And look for keys, take everything off of the table. It was like, put them back, put the stack back on the table, and then say, okay, Judge, that was very funny. I really need to go now. Please return the keys. And then walk back in there, and the keys were sitting on top of the pile of newspapers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good stuff. It'd make a great movie, but nobody'd believe it.
No, that's the thing, is I don't try to tell people these kinds of stories. Obviously, it freaks a lot of people out to think about this, but as we said, in our experience, it was not something that was in any way, we didn't experience it as being malevolent, however you wanted to put that. It just didn't have
It was playful. It was benign.
Mischievous or whatever, like letting its presence known. But as I said, my mom was definitely strange, and she liked to dress up like a witch for Halloween and had a reading that she would do, and was very theatrical about a lot of things. And she decorated the house and did all kinds of things for every season. She was big about Christmas too. But anyhow, she one time we were sitting around the table, and it was two of my sisters and my mom and my dad. And we sit down, everybody holds hands because we're about to have a blessing. And when we do, clump, one of the doors closes upstairs. And then you hear this, and my dad pauses. He's not saying the blessing. Did you guys leave anything? So we just sat there, and you could like hear somebody go creak, clump, clump, coming down the stairs. And they went clump, creak, clump, because we had like a series of creaky stairs coming down the stairs. Clump, clump, creak, clump, clump, all the way down this. And then blam, landing, and then creak, bloom, bloom, bloom down, and then on the thing right there beside the kitchen. And so then we come in. So then you hear the footsteps coming down the hallway there, and they had these saloon doors coming into the kitchen at that time. And the doors go, whack, whack. We're just sitting here at the table. And we as a family are just sitting there. We haven't had our blessing yet. And here we're doing this. And my mom's sitting, my dad's sitting, my two sisters, and me on the far end. And Mom goes, hello. We were just sitting down to eat. You are certainly welcome to join us. And then she just walked over and got another chair and brought it up right beside her. And she goes, you were about to have the blessing. And so we just sat down, and she just left a space between her and the next hand over there and does this. And then Dad had a blessing, and then we just continued to have dinner. Now, I don't remember anything happening, but my mom just basically continued this sort of conversation and being friendly while we were just being sociable here, having dinner together. And then she just asked what happened with me at school today and what happened with them at school today and that sort of thing. And then
that's probably one of the reasons why this entity, whatever it was, never felt or never became threatening, was because your mom was receptive to it. I don't know.
I don't know either. That's what I'm saying, is that I don't have a solution for it. But as I said, when my sister lived in the house after we did, she and my brother-in-law, they never had any real fear associated with it. And my niece lived in the house there at that time. When they ultimately sold the house and moved out of it, they felt like they were like leaving a friend behind in terms of leaving the house. And I think my niece even said that she had gone in the house and said, if you want to come live at my house, that would be okay. Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's the thing, is that it really was. It was just a case of, it was a phenomenon that we just had to get used to. Now, that being said, I think I sent you a picture of me as a kid when I was 3 going to kindergarten also. And so that was my normal growing up. So by the time I was 3, I was surprisingly mature at that age. And so when I went to school, I can remember my normal was having grown up in that house. I hadn't hung out with lots of other kids, gone to daycare, or any of that kind of business. And so when I got to school and I started thinking about other things, and I can remember I drew a painting of Superman that had an aura around him, an energy field that was around this. And I had drawn this along with flowers and so forth. And my teacher thought it was wonderful and had asked me about what this was. And I told her about this aura of energy that was emanating around the Superman character that was in my thing. Oh my gosh, I was chastised by that, by my fellow students at the school at that time, because the things about spirit were satanic. And so I was considered to be like a devil worshiper or something, because I had mentioned this whole thing about auras and an energy field that was around Superman in my painting. So it was not something that I could share with other people. Times have changed now. We're having this conversation, and I don't feel like I'm going to be outrageously judged, because there's a lot more weird stuff than this that you'll see on the internet all the time.
Well, Jim, I hate to break it to you, we're both going to be judged. The Facebook page that I've got has got about 17,000 people, I think, that follow it. Yeah. There are some atheists, and that is ideally my target audience, is the atheist who's read Richard Dawkins, liked this book, and has got at least enough of an open mind that he's willing to consider a counter argument to the God delusion.
I mean, that actually may get back to the thing with the Dalai Lama and Buddhism.
Yes.
Because that was the whole intro, was so that because of all those weird experiences, we'd gotten involved in the Theosophical Society. And then my mom took me on the world tour thing. The 100th anniversary was in 1975. And we had gone to New York and then to London and then to different lodges that had been found, like in Amsterdam and different cities around Europe, because that's where where it had expanded. The woman who founded it was Russian, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. And now if you'll like Google that on the internet and so forth, you'll see, talking about judgment and so forth. There's a lot of judgment against Blavatsky, and she was a spiritualist. She was considered to be like evil and witchy sort of thing, just because she talked about these whole ideas of spirits. Anyhow, we did this and ended up in India, in what in those days was called Madras, which is now Chennai. And that's where they had a large, over 1,000 acres that was down near the Adyar River that was the international headquarters. And His Holiness Dalai Lama was the keynote speaker. And so I had traveled there. And so I had been exposed to all these different types of religions. And like I said, Theosophia is God wisdom. And the motto is there's no religion higher than truth. And so the basic idea was that all religions have an aspect of truth to it. And so the common thread between all of those is the truth. It really doesn't matter what spin you put on it. You come from one direction and you come from one background, you see it through the filters of whatever your background is, but you still see, it's kind of like what I was saying about the spiritual experience, is that you'll bring different words and time frames and so forth, but essentially people get a similar experience. The whole experience of having an experience of what you and I may call God as being light and energy, a sense of peace, a sense of love. We have that sensation that's going with it. You may call it God, I may call it God, but somebody else may call it something else. That sensation, that experience of spirit.
Exactly. And what I was going to say earlier was when we were talking about, you were concerned about people condemning you, and I said, no, they're going to condemn both of us. There are some people that follow my page that are devout Christians, and they insist that ghosts do not exist, that there's only the demonic, and that's the only possible explanation for what the experiences that you and I shared in that house. That's the only thing that they would allow as a potential explanation, is that they're demons, not ghosts. But I don't understand why demons would not ever want to do harm, why they would not ever want to cause turmoil. Like I said, this was all playful. This was mischievous. It was not mean-spirited. It wasn't evil.
Now, that's a case where people interpret a lot of things. The fact is, miracles happen all the time. They're documented a lot throughout our things, and every religion talks about some aspect of miracle where something seems to appear, seems to happen for reasons that can't be explained based upon what we think of in terms of classical physics, right? So from a quantum physics perspective, you may be able to explain it in terms of, time travel, boom, something pops into being and then pops out again. But that becomes a whole different discussion that you have when you start talking on that level. My personal thing is, I think that the people who have a problem with this and can't understand that are the ones who are trying to have an idea of God that's a classical image of classical physics version of God, that has like a physical body, that has these sort of things. And we physical bodies were made in the image of that. I don't buy into that. I think that the creative energy that creates us is an energy system. Who we are, this consciousness that we have as an energy system, and the bodies that we have are transient.
The Bible even says that God is spirit, that God is not a physical entity.
I don't think it's even the Bible. My reading of the Bible says it exactly says that. What I'm saying is a lot of people's interpretation of the Bible. They look through the lens. They're looking through the lens of their physical experience, and then they're trying to apply a lot of this through the lens of a physical human body, human being, right? And their version of God has an image like a man with a white hair and this, and heaven has a place that's like a room that's got like this really, so it's got physical walls and so forth associated with it, and boundaries that keep evil out. Well, that makes absolutely no sense, because if God was everything and God is love and it was all created within God, then where did evil come from? Unless God created it. And if God can't be all loving if God created evil, the math doesn't work in my head. That's my personal belief system.
And we could go down that path for a long time, and because I get into conversations about free will, because in my opinion, free will exists because God created us with a choice. If we didn't have that choice, we would be slaves to belief, because what alternative would we have if we had irrefutable proof that God exists?
See, that goes back to an interpretation of the whole thing from the beginning, from a religious standpoint, is that if you go back to the Bible aspect of things, is that you have Genesis 1:1, our like King James version of Bible, and it has the whole creation from the void and the this and the that, and you basically have 6 days, and then God rests, and that's it. That's the whole story. That's the whole creation story, in a nutshell. At the end of the 6th day, God looks at everything he'd done. He already had human beings, male and female, the whole deal. And he looks at it, he goes, he had the template for all the animals and sort of thing. So there's like this experience of doing this sort of thing. He creates this entity that's going to interact in his own image, right? Male and female, he created them in his own image. And then he says, and it's good. So he passed judgment on it, right? He's looked at everything. He says, it's good. And on the 7th day, God rested.
I believe that is a description, or that can be a description of the Big Bang. The Big Bang occurred when God spoke.
That's where I am with the whole thing, right? So that's my perspective on it. So I think that in that context is that we had this creation of what we think of as a manifest universe. So it's essentially a boundary system in which we, who are infinite beings, have an opportunity to experience a finite existence within a finite space, because who we are is like God, who is absolutely limitless. So we are limitless. So we're in the image of God, yet we're being put into this thing like God's children. And it's kind of, you have a kid, you have a baby, it's created in your image and so forth. What do? You just throw it out on the street? No, you like put it in a playpen, right? So it can go move around and explore itself. You put little toys in the playpen so it can do it, but you give it a lot of free will within the context of that. So I think that's it. We were basically given this manifest universe as our playpen, this world as our playpen, and we can either make it into a paradise or something else, because God said it was good, and he's not judging us along the way. And I don't think that God had a specific plan for that. I think that, like I said, my version of God isn't like somebody who premeditated this sort of thing. And I personally think that the one that comes up in the next chapter of the Bible is the one where Adam and Eve think that they've done this bad thing of eating from the tree of knowledge, right? Of good and evil. So they start judging things as being good and evil. So they've done the wrong thing. And then they have this image of God was off doing something else. They weren't connected with God. So somehow Adam and Eve, who'd been created from the mind of God, that's one with God, never been separated from God, think that they're separated from God and that they're able to hide and do something else. I think that was just kind of like a split that happened in our consciousness, and that was the creation of our egos, our sense of self that's separate from that which is our collective consciousness. That's my personal interpretation of that.
That's a fascinating perspective. I've never thought of it that way before.
Yeah, so and then that makes a lot of sense, because then the rest of the Bible is the story about what happened after we, the individual human being created in God's image, forgot that I was created in God's image. And then I started like worshiping idols and all those sort of things, because I then was creating a version of God that was in my own image. And so then that gets into the whole thing, and then how to work all that out. And then I think that was the whole thing with Jesus. And then when Jesus came on the scene, he put it from the context, of course, he grew up being Jewish. And so then he traveled and experienced things. And then he came back having been enlightened, or from a Buddhist perspective, would say he became a Buddha because he had experienced enlightenment, and he came back to teach his connection, his oneness with his spiritual creative source.
It's fascinating that we're having this conversation, because normally we just talk about normal friend stuff, but this is where the conversation really gets interesting from my perspective. Now, in my personal interpretation of things, I'm not opposed to multiverse theory.
Yeah.
And the reason that I am kind of a supporter of multiverse theory is because I watched something that Sean Carroll had put together. And he was talking about a static parent universe, which is eternal. And to me, that's a vague description of heaven as one dimension or universe in this multiverse theory. Then there's the universe where we live, and then there's hell. So it's not an unlimited multiverse. There's an explanation for God, and he's external to this universe. The God that created this universe is not necessarily a member or an entity within the universe. He's external to the universe. He's in heaven.
That's interesting. I hear you on that one. I think the whole multiverse thing makes a lot of sense to me also, like from a basic scientific quantum physics perspective and multiple universes and the whole thing about space-time, et cetera. But again, we start putting a lot of weird ideas about space and time, which are limits that it affects our ability to, I think, experience what I would call God or creative source as it is, because the creative source is not limited by space and time. The limitation of space and time is the creation of us human beings. We created space and time as we experience it. I think that basically we had a playground, but we made up our own game inside this thing. I don't think God is controlling the game. And I think that the outcome is going to be very interesting to see how we explore from the set of this boundary system, but we still have this belief system that we are bound within this boundary system, and there's some controller out of there, that's some entity that's separate from us, but we're actually existing within God. I don't think that there's some man out of the box that's out here observing something that's in the box. That means that the box was created out of something other than the source. What was that thing that's bigger than God?
That's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, it's really not that super difficult.
I think we're coming at this from opposite ends. Maybe it's because I'm left-handed, you're right-handed. Maybe it's because I'm more the computer science and you're the more traditional science. And you've got your degrees in chemistry and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it's a traditional versus an interpretive perspective on the same problem.
Right.
We're all trying to solve the same problem, which is why are we here? The existential questions, basically.
Yeah. And that kind of goes back to the thing that you were talking about with Buddhism, is that Buddhism is an old religion. It was older than Christianity. Buddha was a guy who lived in, 800 BC or something, 900 BC or something like that. And 400, I don't know the dates when Buddha supposedly had his Siddhartha. And then you have his disciples and went off and spread the teaching of Buddha in different parts of the world also. So there's lots of different kinds of Buddhism, just there's lots of different kinds of Christianity out there in the world. There's different versions of Judaism. There's different versions of all kinds of particular religions.
We, for example, are two different varieties of Christianity. I tend to be a little bit more of the traditional variety, and you consider yourself, I believe it's a Christian Buddhist. Now, it's interesting because in my book, I quote Buddha because he said, believe nothing, no matter who said it, even if I said it, unless it agrees with your own reason and your own common sense. That's something that Jesus could have said. It's Supernatural wisdom.
Yes, I agree. And that's what I'm saying is that for me, Jesus absolutely taught the same thing that Buddha taught. He just taught it from the perspective of he grew up being Jewish. And so he had that as his background, whereas Siddhartha grew up being Hindu. And so he spun it from that perspective. And he was basically teaching to an audience that were primarily Hindu. So he couched it in words and descriptions that would make sense to his audience. And I think Jesus did it from the perspective of who his audience were, which were primarily Jews. Romans, I mean, were Egyptians and that sort of thing, because he was experienced with those cultures. So he was just dealing with a different culture. But I think that that's for me, that's why he said the same thing. And so the practice in Buddhism is to be kind. It's to be compassionate. It's to recognize that we're all interconnected. We're all one. That's what Jesus taught. You do this to the least of these, my brothers. You're doing this to me.
If your dad was a Baptist and your mom was a Methodist, I'm guessing you describe yourself as non-denominational?
Yeah. Really don't have a particular denomination. As I said, I'm okay with being in lots of different kinds of things. I've gone to Catholic services, was very active in the Episcopal Church for a long time. I liked the service and the ceremony of that kind of thing. But as I said, I really like the practice and the teachings of the Buddha. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama was definitely very influential to me, given that when we were in India when I was 13, he was the keynote speaker for the conference there. It was the 100th anniversary of the Theosophical Society, so 1975. And I can remember it was a big deal, and tens of thousands of people came to this thing, many tens of thousands. And so my mom and I were living in this community of grass huts that had been built on the property there for all these people who had come from all over the world. And they had a big conference center that was built. It was just a huge grass hut that was there. And so we arrived early because we'd already traveled through Europe and so forth with this group from New York. Gosh, when we were in New York, was 13 and my mom had made me a member of the Theosophical Society. And so I was the youngest member of the Theosophical Society. And they go to the conference center and you have to stand up and who traveled the farthest and who'd done this and all these sort of things. And we're talking about thousands of people in this big conference center in New York. And they ended up having me, like being the youngest member, come up front and get my picture taken with the president of this and sort of thing. And then we traveled from New York to London and so forth. And we're talking about thousands of people are traveling all over the world together doing the big deal. And or at least hundreds for that portion of it. We had thousands by the time we got to India. I had gotten to know all these people, and so everybody was so excited about they were going to see the Dalai Lama. And I had no idea who the Dalai Lama was. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. I didn't know what a Dalai Lama was. I had no context for understanding this. I can remember we went to the grass hut and we were like on the second row because I guess we were kind of like in the dignitary section being there because it had the president and sitting in a row right in front of us. The Dalai Lama comes in and he looked he was probably in his late 30s at that time. He wasn't an old man and was pretty fit and it was hot. There was no air conditioning. We're in a big grass hut. He was in his robes and he started to speak in Tibetan and he has a translator and all the traditional things. People are bowing to him. I didn't know what all the ritual was. And it was a big deal because tens of thousands of people had showed up for this place. The place was like a city with all of the things that were so excited about this. And so he started speaking in Tibetan and then the translator said whatever he said in English. And I looked over at him and then he said what he said. And then the translator said that looked at him and then he said something again in Tibetan. And then the translator said, and then Dalai Lama looked over the guy and goes, "That is not what I said." And then he looked straight out at us and then proceeded to talk in very slow, but very deliberate English. And it was great because then he's speaking directly and I could hear it coming straight out of his mouth. And now that I have known the Dalai Lama for lots of years and kind of know the history and so forth, that was actually a really rare event because what had happened was that his regular translator had apparently gotten sick or something. And so this was a new translator.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I only found that out through somebody recently in terms of connecting with the whole thing. It was like, wow, that is so interesting.
Now, if this had happened in China, I would have suspected that the Chinese government was putting a translator in the mix that was not there to do a good job, but to send a party message. But in India, I think it was probably just an incompetence issue.
I mean, the thing is, Tibetan is like really super complicated in terms of language. I really have a great appreciation for that now because I have so many friends who are polyphones who speak so many different varieties of, and even if you speak Tibetan, there are so many different dialects and sub-dialects and so forth. Have you ever gone to the like Cockney area in London?
I haven't, but I've heard the Cockney accent.
I can remember when I traveled to England, right? Okay, so I'm in England. I'm from the South and I'm speaking English and I've got blonde hair, blue eyes and so forth. And I'm over there. And also my mom and I didn't get like the full tour package. We knew what the big tour package was, but we basically just kept our money pocketed and we were just going to buy tickets and so forth everywhere we went. So we were making up our travel as we went. So we were like riding the bus and the subway system and all those sort of things. And so it's like pulling up my maps and asking people for directions. And it was really interesting because you couldn't understand what people were saying. And I would be meeting so many people from different countries. And they typically would, particularly when I was in Holland, people thought that I was Dutch. Because so many kids just have blonde hair, blue eyes. It was just like the normal. I just looked like I was Dutch because I was very blonde when I was that age.
Oh, I remember.
And so when I was in England and we would have these international people who would be coming up speaking to me with an accent in English, but they would be assuming that I was and it was very common that people would be talking to somebody else in English and they would turn to me and they would speak in Dutch or German or some other language because they were assuming that I was from one of the countries that looked more Nordic or something like that because that was my appearance at the time. They didn't associate me with looking like an American.
No.
And so as a result, I remember a woman in England saying, "Oh, so are you here learning how to speak English?" I can remember, I've been asked that question before, and I went, "I've never heard it spoken before." And she just smiled, and I just smiled, and that was it, because it was the truth. And that's the way it is in Tibetan also, because I have, since that time, and more recent years, working with the Dalai Lama and the Emory Tibet Science Initiative, and working with lots of different translators for the Dalai Lama and for different events and how you translate things, is that it's really an art and a skill, and that one can make mistakes in terms of translation. I can give you lots of examples of that I've experienced in other translating settings where the Rinpoche or whoever gives a teaching and then the translator gives a word and then you hear, "No, what I should have said was," and then they correct it.
Now, your childhood, growing up with all of these paranormal experiences, that led you to develop an interest, a professional interest. As you grew into adulthood, you became a scientist, and you got your PhD from Emory.
Yeah.
You were on the faculty there for a while, and tell us a little bit about your work there.
I wouldn't say I became a scientist because of my experience. I think that it's like my nature to think about things in a scientific way. And I had these other experiences was part of my experience. But I've always been pretty pragmatic and tried to understand how things worked, and that was normal. But when I did go to Emory, it was specifically I had dropped out of school. I had gone to Georgia Tech, study electrical engineering. I liked working with electricity and electrical circuits, and we used to hang out. And remember, I used to build those oscilloscopes and so forth that I had at the house where I would hook my sound system up to it. It would give us a light show back in the day before light shows were a thing.
Oh, yeah.
And so I thought that was like super cool. I loved doing that sort of thing.
It was cool.
And so that was the thing. So it was like, gosh, I have all these ideas for all these things that I imagine happening. I think I sent you the picture of when I was 3 years old, and I went to kindergarten, and I have my bookcase, this briefcase that I had picked out at the bargain corner that had my compass and my protractor and my it wasn't a slide rule, but it was like a protractor thing. And I had different pencils and rulers that I could measure things and do the angle measures and so forth. And this was me showing up for kindergarten at 3 years old. I had already personally self-selected all of this stuff, put it in that bag. And I was standing there on the porch with my dad with this super smiley face because I vividly remember my thought was I was going to go to kindergarten and I was going to get there and we were going to have computer systems and I'm going to be like connected with my colleagues all over the world. And we're going to be studying all these different things. And it was going to be cool. And the thing was like for the benefit of humanity. We were going to do things that would like help in terms of agriculture and energy. And I was always into alternative energies and all those sort of things as a kid. And then I got to school and kindergarten. It wasn't so much that way. Yeah.
It was a harsh awakening, wasn't it?
It was a harsh awakening. But so then when I graduated from high school, I thought, well, I'm going to get the heck out of Savannah. I'm going to go to Georgia Tech. I'm going to study electrical engineering because then I'm going to have access to all these like computers and connect with people all over the world and do all this kind of really cool stuff. Well, I got to Georgia Tech and dude, we were coding in Fortran on punch card.
I was going to say, I remember the punch card reader in Athens.
Exactly. So the thing was, again, it was a tremendous disappointment because it was not what I had imagined kindergarten to be. Certainly not what I imagined the university to be because I had imagined my version of university was going to be what I expected in kindergarten. And so I dropped out of school again. And then, I dropped out of school that time. I didn't drop out of school in high school. I just didn't have to show up very much because I could like basically test out of it. Then that's when you knew me because I dropped out. I'd done the massage therapy, the wellness, and I had reconnected with my yoga and a lot of things that I had learned when I was young in India. And that was great because then I could make a difference and help people, teach them about breathing. This was before yoga was a thing in the United States, and it was still strange. And yoga, as I taught it, was a spiritual awareness, yoke union. That's what the word means, yoke, yoga. It's that which joins. It's a state of being joined or that which joins. And so it's a joining of body, mind, and spirit. What is typically known as yoga in our culture is hatha yoga. And hatha yoga is one of the limbs of yoga, but it's not yoga as a body. It's yoga having to do with physical bodies. As you have Raja Yoga, you have Bhakti Yoga, you have Jnana Yoga. Jnana Yoga is Jni, which is actually knowledge. So it's God's wisdom. So by studying God's wisdom and the understanding of the workings of the manifest universe, you achieve unification of body, mind, and spirit, and that's Jnana Yoga. Bhakti Yoga is Karma yoga is work in the world. So karma yoga is you just do your dutiful work and service and so forth, and you attain one with God. D is love. And so through love and experience of God's love within yourself, you then can transform the world and have it that way. That's why I kind of think of like Buddha taught karma yoga, work through the life and you do the dutiful sort of thing. Jesus taught something in the realm of bhakti yoga. God's love, or that incredible love, can then translate and create that unification piece. I think I tend in the jnana direction, which is I get a little nerdy about thinking about how things work and all that sort of things. And so that's where I tend to go. The science route is more the jnana yoga path.
I don't really know much about yoga in general. I do know that the stretching that you were trying to get me to do when you were doing your wellness business and keeping me alive, I might add, because I was a mess for many years and you could do magic. People talk about miracles. You were literally a miracle worker, how you could reduce all the tension in my body to nothing. But I am a Christian and I do believe that there is wisdom that can be found in other religions, but I still gravitate toward Christianity as the easiest, the true means by which we can connect with God. Because to me, Jesus was the Messiah. He was the Jewish Messiah. He was the Son of God. And I think that's when people start to get into the concerns about New Age, is when you start talking about yoga or things like that. But it's a spiritual journey that you're on. It's not that I don't know how else to put it, but we're seeking the same end result. We're just going at it two different paths. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, this is the thing, is that, as I said, I think that for me, a lot of Jesus's teaching and the model of Jesus sometimes gets lost in the religion as it gets practiced as Christianity. That's just being honest about that, because I don't think that if you haven't accepted Jesus as your savior that you're going to go to hell. I don't think that Jesus said that.
I did say, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one gets to the Father by me. And it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because in the episode that we just recorded, I spoke to a guy who was the quintessential innocent bystander. He's a guy named Matthew Botsford. And he was in Atlanta on business. He's from Michigan originally, but he's in Atlanta on business, and had dinner in a restaurant, goes outside, and he's standing on the curb waiting on a taxi to take him back to his hotel. And a gangbanger opens up with an Uzi, and he gets shot in the back of the head and is dead before he hits the pavement. And his story interested me for several reasons. One was, he gives an NDE account where he claims he spent time in hell, that he experienced torment that's very difficult to contemplate. Flesh getting ripped off his limbs and then regrowing back in a very painful manner so it can be done again, that sort of thing. And I said, it's very interesting, because you were the innocent bystander. You're not a criminal. You were minding your own business, but you claim that when you were shot and killed, you went to hell. Why? And he said, basically, I grew up in the Christian faith, but I never believed it. And I was a materialist. I was a capitalist. I only cared about making money and doing business. And that's the reason I feel like I went to hell, even though I wasn't necessarily what most people would consider a bad or an evil person. I don't know how to reconcile your beliefs with what he's telling me, except for to say, here are your beliefs on one hand, and I listen to you and respect you for what you're saying. But I've looked this guy in the eye.
I hear you on that one. And I've had lots of people who have experiences like that too. And as I said, from a Buddhist perspective, that's not an unusual kind of after-death experience. But the thing is, in Buddhism, you have this concept of the world that is samsara, the world that is the experience of the world as a physical place. And this is where we suffer. That was the teaching of the Buddha. And so when you die, if you haven't basically accepted your brother, you haven't lived as a Christ, you haven't lived as a Buddha, you haven't been able to recognize and appreciate, what truly is. We'll just use your terminology, gift of God, in terms of the gift of this existence. Then when you leave, you can have regrets about how you lived your life. And you end up in these different interim states of bardo and so forth. And then there are multiple states, they would say, that is reincarnation. And on the lower end of the hierarchy are hell beings. And so there's this whole experience of hell, and there's a middle ground that goes all the way back up. Humans in the middle of the system. And then there's level of demigods and gods, and animals fall into this whole thing too. So the physical existence of what we have in what we think of as the physical world, the human world, is kind of like the middle plane of, you think of it from a scientific perspective, of you've got like higher and lower vibrations. You can think of it like white light. So the world of what we see with our eyes, with our physical eyes, is what we see with the frequency of white light. Yet the reality is that we have infrared and we have ultraviolet that are beyond that, which are actually much greater energies in both of those realms than what it is that's in white light. We just don't see them with our eyes. What happens is that when we die, we go into these states of experiences of these other vibrational realms where we don't have a physical body per se, but we still have the memory and the consciousness and so forth. So when we go in these other realms, we have these other realms of experiences. So that's where, from the Buddhist perspective, then you either can reincarnate in a new body, or you can have an experience and come back into the same one. That's actually part of the teaching of meditation, is allowing yourself to go inside your own self and experience your own personal hell within yourself, so that you can ultimately get clear enough and connected in order to be the light of the world. And I think that's what Jesus taught us to do. And I think that's what Jesus did when he went off and meditated for all the time and did his fasting and etc. To me, Jesus was a yogi.
Oh, dear. You're going to get me in trouble here, Jim. I've been trying to adhere somewhat to a traditional Christian perspective in talking about the book and the material that I present. But in the book, the first 10 chapters are devoted to responding to what Dawkins had in his book, because his book had 10 chapters. So my book has 10, the first 10 chapters address his. The 11th chapter is what I call existential scientific evidence, which is talking about fine tuning of the universe and the Big Bang and that sort of thing, the probability of abiogenesis, the scientific arguments related to existence. Then the 12th chapter is what I call supernatural scientific evidence. And I don't get into our ghost stories, our personal stories, as that scientific evidence. I go toward the EEs, that there's a specific subcategory of them that are known as corroborated veridical NDE phenomena. And that's basically where somebody has a near-death experience. They come back and they report all of this interesting information, including while I was dead or temporarily dead or incapacitated, unconscious, what have you, I learned new information that then a third party can go and investigate and corroborate independently. And so that's my favorite category of NDE evidence. Then there's the other category of experiences that interest me, and that's the Matthew Botsford. The traditional NDE experiences is described as a pleasant hallucination that's produced by the dying brain. That's what a purely naturalist perspective of an NDE would be, is that it's all within the brain and there's nothing external to the brain, and whatever's happening in the brain is happening to ease the transition from living state to the death state. The problem for them is this evidence does not fit into any of those categories. Then there's other evidence that I get into. There's another section, and that's on reincarnation. And as we both know, reincarnation is not a topic that's popular in traditional Christian circles. My whole approach to the book was not to look at evidence that conformed to my existing worldview. I was looking for evidence that supported my argument. So reincarnation, even though it's not biblical, it's not Christian by the perspective of most people, there's two different alternative explanations for that phenomenon, just like there is for the phenomena in your house. Growing up, it's either a ghost or it's a demon. Either when someone claims to have knowledge of a previous life, they're either being possessed by the spirit of a deceased human being, or it's a demon. Demon is always going to be the other option. But just in the situation with your house, where the spirits did not seem to be evil or malevolent or anything of that nature, in instances of reincarnation, there are a few stories where the evidence is approached with a scientific method and it seems rock solid. Now, that doesn't necessarily move the meter to me from I believe reincarnation is true, but I do believe it could be possible based on a few cases that are pretty well documented. And like I said, the scientific method was applied as best as could be done under the circumstances, and the results were solid. So, my question to you is, do you, because you consider yourself a Christian Buddhist, do you think that Jesus is like a reincarnation of the Buddha? Or what is your perspective? How do you?
That's an interesting question. I think that, I guess, in just kind of like in, first of all, back to the business about reincarnation and the story you told about your guy who died and then experienced this other realm and came forth, is that so from, and again, this gets back to when my parents were trying to understand how do they have these spirits in their house? Why would there be spirits in the house? Why didn't they go to heaven or go to hell? Why are they here in the house? What's going on?
Excellent question.
Okay, so from the Buddhist perspective, and it's actually not a non-Christian experience, because the guy that's the rector at the Methodist church here that my sisters are members to, and I go regularly, I really like what he says. He says, we are not spiritual. We are not human beings that have spiritual experiences. We are spiritual beings that have a human experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience.
Absolutely.
So who we are is this energy, this spiritual being, made in God's image, which is pure energy, all right? Given the opportunity for a limitation in form and put into this realm to do this thing that we call human existence. So it's an opportunity for a spiritual being to go to Wally World, some kind of great center to be able to experience some kind of adventure center, like within a container field and this sort of thing. So it's an opportunity to, and that's what we are. So we're these spiritual beings who come into this, but then when we come in for reasons that we don't completely understand, we forgot who we were. We forgot that we were connected with the source, and we still are connected with the source. I and the Father are one. The thing that we forgot. That's the thing that Jesus taught us.
This is all coming around full circle so perfectly. What your pastor, the Methodist pastor there, said echoes very closely my wife's philosophy, which she said, we are eternal souls, and our time here spent on earth, we're just like going to Earth University. We're going off to college for a few years to have these experiences that we can then take with us when we go to the next step, whatever that next step.
And I think that's what it is. And I think that our physical existence on this earth thing is a big cosmic experiment. And we're just one of other big cosmic experience that our source split out. We are just the ones that, for reasons that we don't completely understand now, as we came in and we got enamored with this whole idea of white light, shape, and form. And then we started to think that's who we were. And we thought that we were somehow like separated from God. And that's where in my thing, that's where I think we had like the first version of Genesis, and then the second version of the second 1.2 and on, that second version of the creation, and then the whole thing with Adam and Eve and so forth, is more of, that is the story of how we basically deluded ourselves. Because we started having the judgment of good and evil. And it was our own judgment of good and evil that basically created the split. Because God's not evil, right? And so if we are this spiritual being and we're experiencing ourselves as being evil, or some aspect of ourself as being evil, that creates a split within ourselves. And we need to resolve that. And I think that's what Jesus was all about, was acknowledging that I and the Father are one. And he was the first one that did what, from a Buddhist perspective, would be called ascending. So he ascended with his physical body. So I think that he basically taught the same thing that Siddhartha Gautama Buddha taught, in terms of to really have an appreciation. Actually, here, I'll read you something. This is actually a little card that has the thing, and it's got text on the back of it, which is my daughter Ellen used to got this when we went to see His Holiness. Gosh, what year was that? 2009, I guess it was, when I came back to 2007 when I came back to Emory. And anyway, she used to keep this on her bedside table and had this thing. So it has the thing on the back. It's called A Precious Human Life. Every day, think as you wake up today, I am fortunate to have woken up. I am alive. I am not going to waste it. I'm going to use all of my energies to develop myself, to expand my heart out to others, to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. I'm going to have kind thoughts towards others. I am not going to get angry or think badly about others. I am going to benefit others as much as I can. His Holiness Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama. So
it's remarkable how Christ-like that sounds when you read it.
It's exactly, isn't it? That's what we're being called to do. And the Dalai Lama will absolutely say that Jesus was a Buddha. That's an enlightened one. But the thing is, being a Christ is like a special type of Buddha, because he didn't loop back into the whole rebirth thing.
We could talk about this for hours, because as I've done a lot of research, watching videos and interviews and things of that nature. The Matthew Botsford, the guy that I talked about earlier that went to hell after getting shot in the head by the Uzi, I first found out about him through this program called I Survived Beyond and Back. And the idea was that I Survived was a show on its own standing in merit. And that was a program where people would be shot in a drive-by shooting or stabbed or drowned or whatever. It didn't have to necessarily be somebody trying to kill them. It could have been an accident.
Yeah.
But I Survived was I had this traumatic experience and I lived to tell the tale.
Yeah.
And then this other episode, this other program that kind of was a spinoff of it was called I Survived Beyond and Back. And that's where I first learned about Matthew Botsford and his story and getting shot and that sort of thing. And there was this one other guy. First of all, there was one guy who also had an experience that was in hell after he drowned, but he was Muslim and he'd grown up as a Christian and converted to Islam. And then he had this traumatic experience and he drowned and came back and he talked about going to hell and all that kind of stuff. And what amused me was his name in the program, he was Muhammad or Mustafa or something like that. But his birth name was Marcus. And at the end of the episode, his wife was calling him Marcus again. And so to me, he took from his hell experience, and I got the impression that he had reconverted back to Christianity. But there was this other guy who was a Jewish man, and he had a near-death experience. And when he met this figure bathed in brilliant white light, he was absolutely sure it was Moses that had come to ease him into transition into eternity, not Jesus. So that, to me, Christians are taught or indoctrinated into the belief that the only way to get to heaven is through Christianity. And you made the statement earlier that you didn't think that everyone who is not a Christian is going to necessarily go to hell. And I'm just trying to reconcile all of these different thoughts in my head of, was that guy mistaken? The Jewish man, was it Jesus really? And he just thought it was Abraham or Moses? Or was it Moses? Did the Muslim guy, did he go to hell because he was Islamic, a Muslim? Or was there another reason? Because again, from the account of the guy's story, he was not a criminal type. He wasn't an evil person, but he just wasn't a member of the religion that I'm in. So I don't know how to reconcile all these thoughts necessarily.
Yeah. See, for me, that's where Buddhism is helpful for me. Because in Buddhism, the way that happens is when you die, at the end of any particular incarnation, you then have the spiritual transition period that you have. And unless you become a Buddha or a Christ in that incarnation, you reincarnate. And then when you reincarnate, you have the option of based upon your karma, how you've lived your life. You have the karma, how you've lived your life in the world, in the physical world, sets you up for where you reincarnate within the context of samsara, which is kind of like the manifest universe. All right. So we got the manifest universe, which has all sorts of realms that we can see and we can't see within the manifest universe. And so within that, you have the experience of, at the top of the hierarchy, gods, demigods, human beings, animals, and I think it's hell beings, hungry ghosts, or something like that. So they have some kind of like hierarchy of different kinds of things. And so if you reincarnate, you can reincarnate into the idea of hell type of experience, or you can reincarnate into a heaven-like experience. And your spiritual experience, kind of like I was saying about what my brother-in-law was saying, is that your experience of the spiritual world is somewhat colored by whatever your expectations are, your past experiences. So the guy who was the Muslim had a belief system Muslim basically has an ideology of hell also in terms of that. It was basically an offshoot of the same sort of Hebrew teachings that you had along the way, Abrahamic faith. And so they have a similar kinds of concept. And so he had that experience. Buddhists can have that sort of thing. So that's the reason why they have this belief of coming back and going through the thing where you just try to live the best you can in a particular life. And then if you get to a place but according to their system, is that you don't get out of this whole realm of samsara until we pass through it as a human being. So that's the reason why the precious human life is a precious human life. And that's the reason why Buddha came in the body, Jesus came in the body, and spoke to his people, and then he ascended. And then after Jesus ascended, this is my reading from a Buddhist history standpoint, Gautama Buddha, who died, and then the prophecy was that he was going to reincarnate. And so there was a whole sorts of things in terms of he was going to reincarnate and die. And so he reincarnated, and so the entity was Padmasambhava. And so that was another Buddha teacher who lived in around 1000 AD or so. And so Padmasambhava is a great teacher of Tibetan Buddhism.
Okay.
That's a Tibetan Buddhist thing.
I have to study it in greater detail to understand it better, I think. There's some overlap in what you're saying or your belief system and mine. There's a tremendous amount of overlap.
Yeah, I think there is. I think there's a lot of overlap. That's why I don't really sit in a whole lot of judgment of anybody's what their belief system is, because you're looking at it from a different perspective. It's like the blind guys and the elephant who think it's a tree, think it's a rope, thinks it's whatever the other stuff is. It just depends on what part of the elephant they're touching. And I think that's the case with our spiritual journeys. And I think that our spiritual teachers, such as Jesus and Buddha, and are those who, if we think it's a tree, they will use that to teach us the story about the tree. If we think it's the rope, they'll say, well, climb it, or whatever the thing is. They try to lead us to some version of enlightenment. They'll do it based upon what our cultural background is. That's what the Dalai Lama says. He says, you don't need to change your religion to practice Buddhism. Buddhism is just a way of life. It's a matter of waking up every day, saying that basic thing that I said to you, and accept your fellow person. So he absolutely considers Jesus to be a Buddha, but the thing is they think that we're part of a creative source that is one source that we come into this thing and realm of this world and samsara and how we got into this state of reincarnation and so forth. That gets a little more complicated in terms of explaining it, but it wasn't because it was some outside force came in and said that we're going to experience it. It was an illusion, delusion that happened within our own consciousness of what we think of ourselves as being humans.
It's funny because no part of this conversation is compatible with atheism. Because if atheism is really true, we're just spouting off thoughts that have no real meaning. We're chemical reactions, coding for protein. That's what the body does, and that's why we exist. And when you get into this philosophical, theological realm of trying to come to some sort of understanding, you're only having this closed-minded perspective of what reality is. And to me, I don't care about who thinks I'm a Christian, who doesn't think I'm a Christian, why they think what they think. I care about the truth. I care about learning, and I care about achieving understanding. So that's why these conversations are interesting to me. Is first of all, you're a very dear friend, and I've known you forever. And I can have this kind of conversation with you where we can lay it all out there.
Yeah.
And say what's really on our mind.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, and so to that, I'll just speak to your point about the atheist piece, is that I think that from my perspective is that you sound to me like coming across with a judgment around this atheist thing that is one that I don't necessarily experience, because the thing with Buddhism is not a theistic religion. It doesn't say that this is a creation of a God that is separate from us, that created us. They say we are part of one source. That source is consciousness, is light, and we are that light. So there's no God that's separate from us. We are an aspect of that source and that light who are in these containers that we're experiencing as physical bodies, that we're experiencing as spiritual entities. We're like sparks off of within that one source, and we exist as consciousness within that. So they don't have that we essentially, and I think it's what Jesus taught. For me, he basically taught that he was one with God and that we are the same as him. You believeth in me, and that's it. What I can do, you can do also.
I hear what you're saying, and I'm thinking about it. The problem I have with the we are God and the more Buddhist outlook that you were describing a second or two ago is there is no explanation, if you will, for the origin of the universe and the origin of life. And those are scientific questions that deserve an answer, in my opinion. And if you don't have an entity that is greater in intelligence than the sum of all humanity creating this universe and creating life, then I don't know how you get life and how you get this universe.
I hear you on that one. And that, unfortunately, I don't think that you're quite getting what I'm saying. So that's where I'm telling you is that I think that I hear that you don't get it, but that doesn't mean that what I'm saying isn't true.
Absolutely.
It doesn't mean that it can't be gotten.
And when I'm editing this, I'll be listening to what you're saying several more times, and hopefully it'll sink in. And
so this was the thing that I was saying back to the thing with Einstein and the thinking about the beauty of this manifest universe and the fact that there was like an intelligence to the design, the system of what the opportunity was being here, E equals MC squared. And the matter that we have right here, the matter that we're experiencing as us, is actually just energy and light. It's energy and light. That's the substance that is our source. So I think that's where when the business of, they said to Einstein, do you believe in God? His was more like a God of Spinoza. I'm really not familiar about that.
Yeah, Spinoza's God, and he said God does not play dice. And he had a lot of really interesting conversations where he talked about God, but not in a conventional sense.
Exactly. So that's what I'm saying is that
a theistic God or a pantheistic God, but it was not theistic God. But you have said that you believe in a theistic God because you believe in miracles. Or what do you think a miracle is?
I think is let's see, what's a good definition of a miracle? I think a miracle is an event that allows you to transcend your normal way of seeing and understanding the material world.
I can buy that. How a miracle manifests itself in our world. One of the things in my book, I do mention that I think that miracles are a sign that God exists, or can be considered evidence that God exists. The story of a girl named Annabelle Bean is one that comes to mind. She was a child that had not one, but two different physical ailments, something to do with her stomach not being able to process and digest food. And it would accumulate in her stomach, and she was always bloated. And it was supposedly a life-threatening or potentially a life-shortening situation where she was going to be dealing with this ailment for the rest of her life. It was not going to be a pleasant experience by any stretch of the imagination. Her parents were devoutly religious and blaming God because of all the adversity that their child was suffering. Her mother made the decision that they would leave Boston and fly back to Texas so that she would be comfortable, because she was living in hospitals up in Boston and she was getting treated and it wasn't doing any good. So she took her home to be with her family, basically preparing for the child's eventual death. This girl climbs up into a tree 30 feet in the air. A branch breaks. She falls inside the tree 30 feet down, lands on her head. It doesn't break her neck. It doesn't kill her, fracture her skull or anything. Got some bumps and bruises. But when they pulled her out of this tree, and she's healed, they've taken her back to the doctors in Boston, and he said, we can't call this a miracle. Miracles don't exist in the fields of science and medicine. What we call this is a spontaneous remission. But that's what happened. Was she had these two incurable diseases, and both of them went away when she landed on her head, which to me, that the only word that comes to mind is that's a miracle. It's not like the say versus hockey kind of Russia hockey miracle on ice thing. This was a bona fide act of God. So if miracles like that really happen, if they really exist, we can't say that God is a deistic God like Einstein or the pantheistic God of Spinoza. It's a personal.
Okay, you just made a hop.
Okay.
Me being Mr. Scientist on this one, okay?
Okay.
You just made a hop from an observation of a person who experienced a miracle to some idea of there being some theistic God, that's something that's outside of ourselves, that's looking down and has intervened in some way, because an alternative way of looking at it is that I am a aspect of the source, call it God, all right, which is all seeing, all knowing. I have come into physical existence and I have forgotten that I am God. I've forgotten that I'm God. I've forgotten where I came from. I have this whole dream that I'm having. I think that I've been separated from God. Actually, this is my second version of Genesis, okay? So I'm Adam. God created me in his image. It's a beautiful place. I get all these sort of things. But for some reason, I don't think God's around me anymore. I think that God's abandoned me in some way. I'm lonely. So God, in order to come up with something else, takes a rib out, does this whole thing, creates this whole thing that's separate from that. And then we have this whole story about judgment and separated, and we have like this God doing it to us sort of scenario. And then there's blame and et cetera, et cetera. That, I think, is a version of God. I think that the version of God in the original Bible was it created human beings and all these things. God said it was good. So in scenario number 2 is that I'm suffering having this experience. I could have, for whatever reason, come into this lifetime with a lot of angst and experience. But according to Buddhism, you may experience karma, meaning negative things that happen in the course of your life. But if you can basically live well with your karma, you then can experience enlightenment and become a Buddha or a Christ, which is essentially what Jesus did. Jesus came into a physical existence, had a pretty rough life, experienced and shared miracles with others, and reconnected with his source. And then he told us that we're like him and we could do the same thing.
I know the verse that you're talking about. Jesus, they're sitting around a campfire or something along those lines, and the disciples are arguing, and Jesus said, "Haven't I told you, you were gods?" But I just can't buy that Jesus was telling each of his disciples that they were on his level, that they were able to do. But then again, after he ascended to heaven, the disciples were able to do a lot of the miracles that Jesus did.
And that was what his point was. He said, there will be those who come after me, you can do even greater things. That's what I'm not a super biblical scholar, but I've pulled this off the shelf and found it before. So, and the thing is, in understanding this, you've got to go back and look at the whole translations and what versions you're using and realize what the Greek was, what the Hebrew was, what the this was, and so forth, to be able to understand this. You put it into English, and it's way different than if you look at what it was in terms of what the original language was at the time. And then again, you had the whole story of people were putting things into those. And I'm a big believer in being like spiritually guided into things and to believe in miracles. But as I said, I have seen too many phenomenons in my life of things appearing and disappearing and so forth in the physical world for me to be so locked into the idea that there are a lot of things that I've experienced that would be considered to be miracles. And for me, that extends my faith and my belief in us being created in love. And that's also the reason why, like I said, I'm a big fan of His Holiness, because that's essentially what the teaching is there also. But it's done without a whole lot of judgment. Speaking of miracles, do you know the book A Course in Miracles?
Excuse me?
The book A Course in Miracles.
No, I'm not familiar with that.
You're not familiar in the book A Course in Miracles?
No.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so it's a wacky story. There were a couple of psychologists, psychiatrists, if you can call them scientists. I'm hypocritical because I went to school to study psychology and psychiatry because of the body-mind sort of thing. And when I started studying psychology, I was like, dude, I can't get a PhD in this because I can't regurgitate this kind of stuff. I'm not really on, but now a lot's changed since then. And a lot of things we do with neuroscience and a lot of neuropsychology and a lot of what we know now and a lot of things that come out in terms of, even with Freud, id, ego, superego, and so forth, in terms of understanding aspects of our own consciousness, I think is like super useful terminology. That's actually the cool thing. So there were these two faculty at some prestigious university. And one guy's chairman of the department, the other one is in the department, and they were having a conflict about a whole variety of things. And it had been going on for a while, and apparently they had some kind of a heated discussion and then said, we just need to find another way. Let's take a break. We got to find another way. And so the woman left and went home and was in this state of needed to find another way. And all of a sudden this voice came in her head and introduced himself as Jesus and wanted her to take notes. And so she could write in shorthand. And so Jesus started giving her notations. She started writing it in shorthand. And so the first night, she went home, she wrote out dozens of pages of shorthand, and she then goes back in to see the chairman of the department she'd had the argument with, and she goes, I don't know what happened. This is freaky. I went home and I just started writing this. And she sat it down on his desk, and he could read shorthand. So he started looking at it and goes, why don't you just see if it happens again? I'll type this up for you. I'm just going to type this, and then if it happens again, you write more and do that. And so that's what happened. So this went on for some number of years, was that she had this stuff where she would write, and then she would take it into him, and then he would type it out. So they published it and released it, not for profit or anything like that, because it was just something that moved through her. And so anyhow, it's a book. And so it basically is written from the perspective of Jesus laying out this course in miracles, and that miracles are like a normal thing that happens. It's a transition in terms of being able to change your state of being. I find it to be very useful. So the reason why I'm bringing it in is because when I read the Course in Miracles, it's like coming from the perspective of Jesus giving this story, but it's very Buddhist. It's like the teaching is like Buddhism. And so I read the Course in Miracles, and it's like, yeah, I like this. Makes a lot of sense, because it ties in with Buddhism, and it ties in with the whole Christianity aspect of things also. And so I find it to be pretty useful. Course in Miracles.
Oh, wow. Pretty thick.
Yeah, so this one is, it's it. And it actually is a course. So it has a text that is about, the text is 23, 28. Yeah, so you've got about 500-600 pages of actual text, which is the book portion.
Wow.
And then you have a workbook for students that has a daily lesson for 365 days of the year.
Oh.
You can get up and have whatever your lesson is for the day. And it's actually not 365 individual lessons, because it's set up like a course where you'll have a number, and then you're going to have a review of what you learned in the first lessons. And so you have a series of lessons, and then you have the review of the lessons, and then you'll have, and it has a first chapter, and the workbook itself is split into sections. Depending on that, the order and how you do the exercises changes. And it's very interesting, but part of one of the original exercises has to do with seeing. So it really does causes one to what you with your physical eyes, and what it is that the interpretation that you're giving, what it is that you're seeing with your physical eyes. It's like perception. You don't have clear seeing. And then so it also is very big on the whole concept of Holy Spirit. And so the Holy Spirit in this one is laid out that Jesus specifically put it so that we could call on the Holy Spirit as like an emissary to be able to help each one of us to connect back to where he is, which is at the interface between our manifest universe, which is this part where we have carved out in our consciousness because we think that we're separate from God, which is our source. I'm going to use the God word because that's what I use. But in Buddhism, they don't call it God, they call it source. And it doesn't have physical form. So therefore they call it emptiness.
That's interesting, because
that's why they say that the form is empty, that is being something negative, but that's not what they're saying.
That's very interesting. One of the attributes, if you will, of the traditional Christian God is that God is spirit. God is not a thing. He's nothing. He's no thing. And emptiness is the same thing.
Yes. And that was like there are a couple of different types of Buddhism, but the last teaching of the Buddha that is prevalent in Mahayana Buddhism is when he was about to die, because he knew that he was about to die, and it had already been predicted that he was going to reincarnate. And so he was going to reincarnate, and they had these different things. And so he was sitting there in meditation, and all of his teachers were around him, and then one of the students there asked Avalokiteshvara, who was one of the high up teachers in the whole Buddhist world at that time, and how does one practice in order to learn and become enlightened? The answer is, it's really a beautiful thing if you actually read the whole Heart Sutra, and particularly if you have a good translation that comes out. But it's essentially that what you taste, what you touch, what all these sort of things are not the essence of reality. And it ends with form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is nothing other than emptiness. Emptiness is nothing other than form. And then it says in Sanskrit, a paras, which means gone, gone beyond, beyond gone.
Oh.
Paradoxical, but it's actually unifying in terms of thought process. It's pretty cool. So you just have to like sit with that for a while in order to let that.
Yeah, that's going to have to marinate in my brain for a while.
Yeah, it really is. And so this is the thing that's what I'm saying is that your Buddhism, I mean, like the Dalai Lama and Buddhism in general is considered to be non-theistic. They don't believe in a God that is outside of us that's controlling us. They believe in a source that is love, that is intelligence, that is that, and we are that source. We have just, in our mind, put up obscurations to seeing the truth, and that's the physical world that we see. And so it was a creation of our error and our judgment. And so that's the crux of the Course in Miracles, is exactly what Jesus teaches. It's our purpose is to let go of judgment. Judge not lest ye be judged.
Amen.
Okay? So that's what this whole thing is. That's what we're each to do, is to stop being judgmental of others and of ourselves. Forgiveness. Forgiveness is the key to the kingdom. And this is the thing, as I say, so it basically is the teachings of Jesus in terms of forgiveness, but it's very, from my mind, it's very Buddhist in terms of the context in which this thing is done. Now, the people who translated this, they were psychiatrists, atheists, had grown up Catholic or whatever the thing was. So it was not like they had a particular spiritual or any Buddhist background going into writing this thing. It's just remarkable to me that it's super helpful for me, because I'd gotten disillusioned with a lot of Christianity. And then when I ran across this, it was like, wow, this is so cool, because it actually puts it from the standpoint of, it's basically, for me, A Course in Miracles is like Jesus teaching Buddhism.
It's an interesting way of putting it.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to read it.
Yeah, and so I find it to be real helpful. So it's got a preface, a text, workbook for students. It's got a manual for teachers, a clarification of terms, and some other things. And it's really pretty powerful for me. And it's best if you can find like some friends or a group or people who would be interested to have discussions with it. And I'm fortunate to have run across those. But like for me, I find it to be super helpful.
Very good.
Yeah, and it really helps me because I like to go back and pull off scriptural references and so forth and look back through them and think of it. Because I grew up with a background in Christian stuff. And of course, a lot of my friends are too. But it also helps me to frame Jesus' teaching and works also, so that I said I can talk about it with my Buddhist friends also. But because Buddhists who didn't grow up as Christians, a lot of people who grew up as Christians, Catholic in particular, and then were like burned by the Catholic Church, and then they like reject Christianity, and then they go into Buddhism. That's a whole different energy than a person who is
never been a Christian.
Yeah, with Dalai Lama or with one of the Rinpoches that I've spent time with and done a lot of practices of visualization and inner cleansing, as long with chanting and so forth. And I was talking to them about, like, I said the whole thing about Padmasambhava, which is an interesting character, because Padmasambhava is like a Christ-like character in Buddhism, in the Mahayana version of it. And so a lot of practices happens around the Padmasambhava. And so I went up to the guy and I says, I really like the practice and all what we're doing in terms of the chanting and the toning and everything we're teaching here. I says, but I really am like tuned in with the Jesus thing. He goes, no problem. Just use Jesus as Buddha too. It's all good. I said, okay. So that's it.
Very good.
Yeah, there's no, like I said, again, that's where I think it's unfortunate, because Jesus was so forgiving. People who call themselves Christians have a tendency to be so judgmental.
That is the truth, my friend. That is definitely the truth.
And that's where we have a conundrum. And yeah.
I was just going to say, I hate to stop you there, but we said that we were going to try to do this in an hour, and I see that we're at 2.5 hours again. Yeah.
So,
all right, my friend.
Maybe we'll get back together and do a short version sometime. We'll do a summary sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Well, thank you again for your time, and it's been wonderful.
Yeah.
It's always a pleasure, Jim.
It's a pleasure. Talk to you later.
Thank you for listening to The God Conclusion. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing to this channel. Join us again next week as we continue to seek truth. Quid est veritas.